but you know, like in the manner of a good host, we must be nice to everybody and all that. But on the question of, I think on the question of Adivasis, though Ambedkar, I mean, I have critiqued him about the language that he used and the way he called it. It was very similar to the language Gandhi used about Dalits, you know, very, very similar. But Gandhi was not any great admirer of them either. No, I mean, he also called them savages. He said the Santals are the only people who are as bad as the Kafirs, which he used to call the black Africans, you know. And if you read David Hardiman's book, you see how, you know, even when there were people who, there was a big a massacre of Adivasis in the region, in the princely state of Gujarat, and Gandhi just never used to engage with anything that didn't have to do with the British. So it was just ignored. You know, the Congress, Gandhi, all of them ignored it. So, but I must say that, you know, I certainly have, I certainly have views on the idea of Adivasi homelands. I certainly have views, even though I am aware that an organization like the Narmada Bachao Andolon did not take cognizance of caste. But I am a very great admirer of the argument against the Big Dam, you know. And I think it's a very profound argument and a very important argument. But how it should be fought, because I think it's the basic unit for corporate capitalism, you know, that. So I mean, I just feel that, you know, the way we define, for example, the way we define what is oppression and what are these battles we are fighting, you know, from the perspective of women, from the, you know, NGOs cannot be dismissed. At the same time, there is a very important critique of the role Ford Foundation, Rockefeller, all these people have played historically, even in the anti-apartheid movement, in the civil rights movement, in Indonesia. You know, so at individual moments they do good things, but what is it that they want? What is it that they are looking for? You know, we have to understand that. You know, it's not that we have to become people who cut off everybody's head, like who steps out of line. But we have to understand how the game is being played. I think it's very, very important to understand that. You know?
Yes, because I was this NGO question. You know, because as you said, you have to look at multiple strategies. You know, these NGOs actually serve, given the kind of state we have and given the kind of NGOs that the state promotes. If you look at the rural cooperatives, all are state funded. These are kind of NGOs which state funds, subsidize and so on. So these serve as sites of strategies for them. So it's not. Yeah. So this has to be somewhere broken up and brought out, so that, because otherwise it's just kind of polarized.
No, I think there are different kinds of NGOs, and you know, an NGO which is funded by Vedanta, you know, is a different matter from an NGO that is state funded or you know, yeah, actually. So you have to. But the main thing is not to become like mullahs, you know, saying, oh, this person is a sinner and this person is a saint. But we have to understand the role of the dice. You know, you have to understand the larger agendas of people. And we all can't be pure. I mean, none of us can be. None of us can be, you know. So that's not the point. The point is not to go around. And I think one of the greatly debilitating things that Gandhi did to Indian politics was to bring in the question of purity. You know, like you have to eat goat curd and wear a loincloth and not have sex, and otherwise you're a bad person. So it debilitates the imagination, you know. That's not necessarily the only way to do politics. You know, we can also be bad people and do politics.
Last quick one, there is in Ambedkar actually there are a variety of scholars who take him around on the class question. He appears as a socialist. At times he appears as someone who is more concerned about freedom, and by freedom he also means the right of economic exercise of becoming rich. Right? So he's not necessarily anti-capitalist society. What he would talk about then therefore is maybe a capitalist society with possible morals of justice and welfare and so on. And given the newer wave of some Dalit intellectuals talking of possibilities of capitalism for Dalits, Chandravan Prasad and this making of Tikki and so on. So I'm sure you also, how do you see this game of?
I mean, I see it in two ways. One is that I think it's really high time we all stop thinking that Dalits are just some homogeneous mass who has to have one opinion about everything. So like everybody else, there are capitalists and communists and BSP, and that's great. I mean, I certainly am not among those who believe that the corporate neoliberal agenda is going to bring anybody any kind of equality. But within that, when you look at what is going on, I think that Dalits have more of a right to be, to at least have some capitalists and millionaires and all of that. You know, it's not. You can't just say, oh no, just wait for the communist revolution. You know, that'll amount to what the communists said to women. You know, just hang on, and after the revolution, we'll see about you. We can't have that. You know, so.
Further linked to the question of caste and the morals of charity in our indigenous Hindu culture, if you also look at who is really engaged, the corporates that are engaged in giving most money, there are very few Hindu corporates actually. It's Azim Premji and the Tatas. So this
they
is
like
also...
to build temples, no? I mean, there's a quote here about the Birla saying, we don't actually believe in all this, but we like to keep people religious, so we build these temples and so on. But yeah, I mean, now it's come to a stage where you don't know, I mean, corporate capital doesn't have a country, you know. So the Tatas, the Ambanis, they are, you know, instituting chairs in Harvard and Stanford, sending out millions. The Bill Gates Fund is working here, you know, it's all, it keeps us on our toes, you know. And you have to look at things through so many multiple filters, you know, and it's not easy, but we have to do it.
Now I think the audience should be having some questions, so we'll be over to some questions, and I want Sharmila, if you can help, unless you want to begin with a question. He has one mic and there's somebody can handle the other mic, and there's one hand I see there.
Hi ma'am, just a couple of questions. Firstly, there's very little mentioned in our school textbooks on the social realities of caste discrimination. What is the manner in which you would recommend school textbooks to introduce such topics and their social realities so as to educate us better? And the second question is, considering that the BJP draws most of its electoral strength on from upper caste Hindus, if a Modi-led BJP government were to come to power later this year, are there any specific or additional challenges that people from the lower caste will face either in the short term or the long run? Thank you.
First of all, one of the things that I'm trying to do is to change the language of saying upper caste and lower caste. You know, I mean, in my essay, I talk of privileged caste and subordinate caste. That's very important for us to understand power, you know. Because upper suddenly starts sounding as if it has some other things. About your question about school textbooks, well, I mean, I would say the simple answer to it is that people should read Ambedkar. They really should. If they won't prescribe them in classrooms, then maybe out of classrooms. But people should read Ambedkar, you know. And one of the efforts of this book and many of us is to just try and make that possible. But I also, having said that, want to say that we mustn't turn Ambedkar into another holy cow, you know. He was a brilliant man with some brilliant arguments, some flaws, some things we would like to argue about, and that would be the greatest tribute to him, you know, not to turn him into a, you know, not to condemn him to purity in some way. The question about if the Modi-led BJP came to power, you know, a great part of my introduction has to do with the ways in which the Hindu liberals and the Hindu rights have jockeyed for this Dalit constituency, right from the early 20th century or the turn of the century onwards. And you see that it still plays out today, you know, whether it's them conducting these Ghar Wapsi sort of ceremonies in the forest to make Adivasis return home, which is so ironic. You're trying to tell an autochthonous tribe that has lived there for centuries to return home to Hinduism, which is much newer. But I think what we will see is something which already started in the 1940s, you know, as partition loomed on the horizon, the sort of Sanskritization and the Hinduization of Dalits, which I think is something that really made Ambedkar despair, you know, because we haven't spoken about it, and I don't want to start that discussion now because it will take a long time, but after what was called the Pune Pact, where basically Ambedkar was forced to give up his demand for a separate electorate, Gandhi started this whole temple entry movement with the Harijan Sevak Sangh at the front of it, and the Harijan Sevak Sangh was not allowed to have any Harijans in it. I mean, Harijan is an obnoxious word, but I'm just saying that was his word. But Ambedkar was so worried about this kind of false embrace, you know, pulling people back into the temples from where the whole system of caste began. And this kind of Hinduization is happening at a tremendous pace now, both within Adivasi cultures as well as amongst Dalits, you know. So, in a way, it perpetuates caste, but makes them stay within the fold of Hinduism in the servants' quarters and pits people one against the other. You see, now with what we are in for is how have people traditionally held on to power by making everyone else fight, you know, and that is what is going to happen, and that is happening a lot in the Dalit movement, just pit them against each other, you know. So that is the answer to that question.
Lots of hands. So, okay.
I think one of your observations, my question is to Arundhati. One of your observations need to be checked or rather corrected factually. You refer to the textile strike of 1928, called by Comrade Dange and others. See, in the demands, the charter of demands for the strike, this demand that the untouchables should be given employment in weaving department, that was mentioned, that was very well there. But it is quite true that particular demand was not the priority of the other economic demands were the priority. But that demand, at the instance of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, was included because he also led a very not a very big union, but he also led a small union which was a part of the strike earlier. Then subsequently so happened that Dr. Ambedkar thought that that particular demand is not a priority of the strike. Then he withdrew from the strike. Not that Gandhi refused to include that demand. So that is factually correct.
I mean, the thing is that that rift went on for a long time after that. It continued unto the elections later, and it was a very unpleasant exchange between them.
We'll take a couple of questions and then we'll answer. I'm just going by one from the left and one on the right. Sharmila, okay, this person with the mic there. Yeah.
Good evening, ma'am. Now, Ambedkar in speeches and even in his books has constantly referred to, has constantly told the Dalits to convert to Buddhism. Now, what happens is that when people from the lower caste they convert to another religion, the institution of caste still exists, and this has been seen in the case of Dalit Christians, and even in other religions, caste has maintained its significance. So, wouldn't it have been better if Ambedkar had actually concentrated on bringing in internal reforms in Hinduism and giving more push to that, rather than pushing for conversion? Where what would have been? What do you think would have been the better tool to fight against casteism?
One from the left there. Excuse me, Mike. Wait a second. There's somebody else who's been raising their hand there. Please, no, give it to him. Yeah, it's a lottery. Yeah, and there's right. Yeah, depends on who he sees.
Hello, ma'am. It's more of a doubt and clarification that I would like
Can
to
you
have.
put closer to the mic?
It's more of a doubt and a clarification that I intend to have within myself. The first thing is that when we talk about the annihilation of caste, and that was written in 1936, and afterwards when we talk about in 2014, let's say, it's a lot of a gap that we have traveled for even for a Dalit community as well. There have been most of the political parties, they take it as a pride. As we say that Brahmins have pride for themselves, Dalit too have a pride for their caste. But the one thing that we talked about, the homogeneity of a Dalit, is not what we generally talk about. If we talk about the Dalit in a heterogeneity way, it's also having like annihilation of caste in what way? Like if you see the hierarchy of a Dalit, what comes in the down and what comes in the upper thing. So in that sense, what do we need to understand with the context of this? We talk about, okay, this is what we have been oppressed, this is how the historical things have gone through. But if for a Dalit to understand, okay, I am a Dalit, and this is what I see, there is a subjugation and discrimination among the Dalit communities as well. Then where does the Ambedkar's point of argument this comes into the picture when we talk about in the present day?
Okay, on the Buddhist thing, since about this Buddhism, how caste kind of persists. I think Ambedkar's approach, there is a connection I see from 1936 to 1956, and I'm not as familiar with the Buddha and his Dhamma as a text. I find it a very difficult text to read, and I've read it in parts. And I was particularly interested, especially after listening to Ashwari Kumar's paper on the idea of Vichcheda. Vichched is there's a kind of a traditional idea which has been debated in the Upanishads and in the Buddhist texts earlier to that. Vichcheda is the concept of which comes from also Shunyata and annihilation of a negation. And Ambedkar poses the question: is the Buddha negating life? And he talks about how kind of an annihilation of caste. He also uses this word living death. How for a lot of Hindus and Dalits as well, who call them, if you live with caste, it's basically you're a walking carcass as far as he's concerned. So for him it was about a rebirth. And if this rebirth involved embracing a religion which discards caste, and if you see the 22 vows of Dr. Ambedkar, he is saying, I will not, it's all about negation. I will not do this. I will not accept the Brahma, Vishnu, Maheshwara. I will not accept the Brahman. I will not. So he moves into something, but yes, the Buddhists, later the Buddhists, have been surrounded by others who practice caste. So it becomes difficult not to practice caste when everybody else around you is practicing caste. Ambedkar's call towards the renewal of Buddhism was not only for Dalits. It was not about practicing a religion in the religious sense. He thought of religion as sacred morality. Of course, Arundhati and I had a discussion about this morality business. He said morality is a difficult thing, but for him, it was a moral code that helps you not do the kind of violence you would habitually do with somebody. Not do the kind of violence with which the subtle violence with which Suryakant Bhagmuri's book opens, where somebody can, with entitlement, sit on a vehicle and then just say, where is this other guy? You know, that kind of entitlement with which that happens. So that caste persists in other religions is because caste, these religions are surrounded by caste, if that could be an answer to the question. And to the other question, I'll leave it to you.
I won't do it, but I wanted to read one of the footnotes in my essay. See how a writer like Ismat Chugtai, a Muslim, feminist, progressive writer, and you should, I mean, there's a short story of hers in which she describes a sweeper, a Dalit woman. It is so dismaying, you know, and yet even today it's translated proudly by feminists and they don't. Okay, I'll read it to you. It's a description from a short story called A Pair of Hands. And this is the text. Gauri was her name, the feckless one. And she was dark like a glistening pan on which a roti had been fried, but which a careless cook had forgotten to clean. She had a bulbous nose, a wide jaw, and it seemed she came from a family where brushing one's teeth was a habit long forgotten. The squint in her left eye was noticeable despite the fact that her eyes were heavily cold. It was difficult to imagine how, with a squinted eye, she was able to throw darts that never failed to hit their mark. Her waist was not slim. It had thickened, rapidly increasing in diameter from all those handouts she consumed. There was nothing delicate about her feet which reminded one of a cow's hooves, and she left a coarse smell of mustard in her wake. Now this is a progressive Muslim woman writer, and nobody even points out, look, I mean, what is this, you know, what is this, what is wrong with all of us, you know, and it's an imagination, because you know that in any case, the chances are that a laboring body is more beautiful than a body that's been sitting and eating pan in some bed, you know. But the prejudice just comes out in the most unbelievable ways, and we don't even, it doesn't even cause a blip on the ECG, you know. It's presented to us as a celebratory thing, the translation of this short story. I was just shocked. So, I mean, I myself am not a Hindu. As I said, I grew up in a Syrian Christian family, but not a very religious one. And yet, everybody around you practices caste. And when I wrote The God of Small Things, firstly, I got into trouble with the Marxist Party, because it is about this tension between the Marxists and Naxal and Dalit and all that. And then I had people coming, I mean, I grew up in that village, right? Those were my friends that I was writing about. And people telling me, no, you don't understand. It just can't happen. It just can't happen that a Syrian Christian woman and a Parliament can make love. It can't happen. And I was taken to court for corrupting public morality, you know, by 5 lawyers who basically just photocopied the last chapter, which was so offensive to them, and sent it to court. It was in court for 10 years. Every time the hearing came up, the judge would say, each time this case comes before me, I get chest pains, and he would postpone it. But, you know, these are the prejudices. It's not just about atrocities and killings and beatings, and it's in the air we breathe, you know.
There's question there. The woman with the
Yes,
one second.
1 minute.
1 second. I don't know who has it. This woman here, she is questioning it. Yeah.
Mine is not a question, it is just a comment. When we are talking about annihilation of caste, I think we need to take serious note of, the most profound contribution that social revolutionaries starting from Phule to Ambedkar and Shahu made about the link between caste and gender, and how gender violence is what is the most crucial factor in keeping caste alive. And I think that we have to really give a lot more importance to this aspect of their writings, and also see how we can have an organic kind of link between Dalit activists and gender activists to eliminate both these obnoxious hierarchies, caste and gender.
That's in the book actually, quite a lot about gender and caste and Ambedkar's whole engagement with the Hindu Code Bill, and also about Phule, and it is there, you're absolutely right.
There was another person who was about to ask a question. Can I see the yeah, there please.
This is, I just would like to, how will conversion into another religion, particularly